thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about emotions. As you know, I'm all about the wellness, and I find that the temptation, including myself, by the way, part of my journey, was to focus on the physical aspects of wellness, so food and exercise, for example, but health is more than what we eat. It's what we think, what we say, and what we believe too. So emotions play a huge part in the overall picture of wellness. I wanted to touch on those this evening, in particular, how to manage our emotions. So I always like to look up the dictionary definition. So for emotions, it says a strong feeling deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others. So there's lots of different elements there, but in a nutshell, emotions are feelings, and feelings drive our emotions. So if we want to change our actions and our behaviours, then we need to address our feelings too. And what I've come to realise through my own wellness journey is that we are meant to feel all emotions. You know, I have realised that we need to experience the lows in order to appreciate the highs, but some emotions are really uncomfortable. They don't feel very nice, and so I personally used to stuff them down and suppress them and to not acknowledge them. But unfortunately, over a long period of time of doing that, that can lead to physical ailments, to poor health. And I myself was very sick and very miserable. And having worked on my mindset and in particular managing my emotions, my body has also recovered. So for me, I'm going to say a lot, but health is more than just what we eat. It's what we think, say, and believe too. And I know that I'm not the only person that's stuffed down or fails to acknowledge my emotions, because I see it a lot in my clients. And from a young age, we're taught to suppress our emotions. You know, big boys don't cry, nice girls don't make noise, all don't cry. And I do a lot of my client sessions online, but if I have somebody come to my home for a session, I really have to sit on my hands if somebody starts to be tearful, because if I reach over and give them a tissue, I'm basically indicating that they should stop crying. And I don't want my clients to stop crying. I want them to get in touch with the emotions so that we can work through them and release them. So I have to sit on my hands and not pass the tissues. But I think we all do it. You know, if somebody's crying, we say, oh, don't cry. But actually, tears are the body's way of releasing sadness and releasing emotions. So it's important that we do allow those to come up. So the reason I want my clients to cry, I always get very excited when they cry, is because I know that we've hit the nerve. If we can address the emotion, then we can work through it and let it go. Just like our body gives us physical signs that something's out of balance, and if we don't listen, you know, it starts with a little whisper, maybe a headache or a tummy ache, and if we don't listen, then it will start to shout. So more frequent headaches, worse tummy ache, more often. And if we still don't listen, it will start to scream. Well, emotions are the same. They're just trying to get our attention. They're telling us that something's up or out of balance or not right or doesn't sit well with us. And if we keep ignoring those emotions, then they will get bigger and stronger and more persistent. So it's important to acknowledge what they are really. It basically means something needs addressing, you know, whether that's the way that you think or a situation or a relationship, for example, something needs addressed if these emotions keep coming up. So actually just recognizing an emotion can help to reduce its intensity. So that's a very easy step to do, or so it sounds. But emotions can show up both physically and mentally. So for example, an emotion might come out in overthinking or, you know, being stuck on a particular thought or situation, but they can also come out in our body. So you might get a nervous tummy, you might feel anxious, you know, heart pounding and so on. You might find that you can't sleep or that you've got no appetite. So emotions aren't just in our minds, they also show up in our bodies, which is why if we don't address them, it can lead to poor health. So one of the first things we can do is recognize what the emotions are. So there are lots of different emotions. I'm going to cover a few. So fear, anger, sadness, guilt, joy, happiness, and contentment are a few different emotions. And so, as I say, some of those can be uncomfortable, can't they? So we don't acknowledge them. But I like to talk about topline and baseline emotions. So I'll give you an example. Maybe you've come home and your partner hasn't done the washing up, and that might make you feel angry. And that is what I would call the top line emotion. But I find that there's generally a baseline emotion underneath that. So it might be that actually you feel disrespected or offended, you might feel some resentment, and it's those that leads to the top line emotion of anger. So I always ask myself and I ask my clients, well, what's your baseline emotion? If anger is your top line, what is the emotion that's driving that anger? And doing that allows us to get to the real root of what's going on for them. So how can we recognize what our emotions are? So how can we recognize what emotions we are feeling? Well, it's about giving yourself the time and space to allow that to happen. You know, in a very busy life, it's something that we can easily push to the side and say, I haven't got time for that. But, you know, a little bit of immediate time taken up can lead to a better use of time further on. Sometimes it's just worth taking the hit in the short term. So actually giving yourself the time and space to recognize what your emotions are. And, you know, you could do that in a number of ways. I often ask my clients to do 15 minutes of absolutely nothing. No reading, no music, no TV, no talking, nothing. Just sit in silence for 15 minutes. And it's the one that most people struggle with because it's uncomfortable. All sorts of thoughts come in and all those emotions that we've been pushing down might start to come in and we don't want to feel them. So it's the one that people struggle with. But that 15 minutes of silence, and by the way, actually an hour would be brilliant because your brain would go on a whole journey in that time. But given that it's such a challenge for so many people, I start them with 15 minutes. And it just gives you that time to acknowledge what's coming up for you. You can also journal or brain dump. Maybe you could go for a walk and just give yourself some space. And actually just stopping to ask yourself the question, what emotion am I feeling? What is this emotion? What's my top line emotion and what's my baseline emotion? And actually carving out that time and space to allow yourself to recognize what the emotion is the first thing that we can do, really. But why are emotions so important? Well, for many reasons, but the one I'm going to touch on today is that typically we have autopilot or subconscious behaviors that are attached to certain emotions. So some typical ones might include comfort eating, not eating at all, self-harming, crying, withdrawing, staying up late, sleeping lots of hours, not getting enough sleep. So there's lots of ways. These are just a few examples. But often we have a pattern, or more often than not, have a pattern attached to certain emotions. So if you find, for example, that you eat lots of sweet foods, but you'd really rather stop that, then it's worth looking at what's the emotion that drives you to that, because there is an emotion and a pattern connected to it. So if you want to break some of these patterns that aren't serving you in your life, such as comfort eating or not getting enough sleep, crying, withdrawing socially, then you want to look at what the emotion is behind that, what's leading to that. And that awareness is 50% of the battle. So if you know that you've got this pattern and you know what the emotion is, you have got such a greater chance of changing that pattern and that behavior to something that's more conducive and beneficial to your life. So identifying what your patterns are, your behaviors are, and the emotion that's connected to those is the second thing that we can do, because it's those behaviors that most of us want to stop and that we struggle to stop, and that's because we're only looking at one piece of the puzzle, but there is an emotion that drives that pattern, and we need to figure out what that emotion is and actually identify that we have this pattern. So once you're aware of it, you can do something about it, right? If you're not aware of it, then you can't do anything, you've got no chance. Next, I want to talk about emotions in the context of zones. I should have a PowerPoint or something. Draw it on here. I don't have a blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. So over, under the zone. Hopefully you can see this. Oh, wrong way. So I'm thinking about emotions in zones. So this is the optimal zone. This is where we are able to feel our emotions, acknowledge them, and be rational about them. And here is where we are over emotional, so we're super sensitive to things. And down here, this camera's back to front, down here is where we are under emotional. So I talked earlier a bit about being numb, is where you might not feel things. So in terms of the zones, you might find that in the too much emotion, that you're super sensitive, you feel very overwhelmed by your emotions, You might find that you're anxious, for example, and that's because you're stuck in this stress response. So you're super alert to everything and very sensitive to it. So that's kind of over the optimal zone. And then we've got the zone, which is where we understand, where we're measured and we're balanced and we're rational, but we're still having those emotions. And then the third zone would be too little. So you're numb, maybe you feel empty, you feel depressed or disconnected, your motivation is likely to be low. And feeling numb, by the way, is just the brain's way of protecting us. I was very numb, as I mentioned earlier. I couldn't cry. I felt very little sadness and I felt very little joy. Because when you numb one emotion, you numb them all. You can't numb in isolation. So if you're numbing yourself from pain or hurt of some kind, then you'll be also numbing yourself to joy, which means that other people, for example, you might find it really excited about things or very happy about things, and you're just because you've limited the range of emotions that you can have. And it's really just our brain protecting us. So our brain is shutting down our sensitivity to emotions in order to stop that pain from destroying us, taking over, overwhelming us. But as I say, it sounds beneficial perhaps because you're protecting yourself from some of those less comfortable emotions, the more painful ones, but you are also limiting your ability to experience joy and happiness and fulfillment and love. So it's not really all that it's cracked up to be. So the third step that we can take is to recognize what zone we're in. Do you reside in one of those zones more often than not? Which zone are you in right now? Can you recognize when you move from one zone to the next? So recognizing the zone, understanding what moves us from the zone to oversensitive or undersensitive, which moves us, and then also identifying some tools to help bring us back to the zone where we are balanced and moderated and rational. So, anyone care to share what zone they're in right now? I would say that I'm in the zone right now, but in recent weeks, I've definitely been in oversensitive. You know, a breakup would be the trigger for me moving from the zone to being oversensitive. But I work very hard to practice what I preach, and I've thrown everything at myself so that I can get myself back into the zone. So I want to give you some tips. So I want to give you some tips for keeping yourself in the zone, the optimal zone when it comes to emotions. So it's nothing new here, stuff that I talk about all the time: meditation, grounding, such as walking out on grass, going to the sea, being in nature, exercise, whether that be yoga or something a bit more high intensity for you, but regular exercise, it induces feel-good endorphins. Journaling, I know this is something that's very uncomfortable for people, but once you get over that hump, and a good way to start is just to go to the internet or to the group. There's some suggestions in there on asking yourself questions, because often a blank page can be very daunting to people just to start writing. And just brain dumping, you know, getting a piece of paper and just dumping everything that's on your mind and what you're thinking and what you're feeling, what's showing up in your body. Sharing, so unloading with friends or family or your partner. I think of emotions as like a balloon, and if we don't let some air out, then the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and we just become full of emotions, and that pushes us into the oversensitive zone. And if that persists and becomes painful, we might then move to the undersensitive zone in order to protect ourselves. So actually letting some air out of the emotional balloon through sharing or journaling, talking generally, is very helpful in keeping us in the zone. Stuff like mindfulness, actually working on your mindset. So I would say that I used to have a very fixed mindset. That's just the way things are. But now I've worked very hard to create a growth mindset, and to also just kind of prioritize myself, respect my boundaries. So things like saying no, carving that time out for myself, working on my limiting beliefs, realizing that I don't have to be all things to all people all the time, and setting myself realistic expectations. So lots of different little small changes lead to big changes, and that's led to an improvement in my mindset. And in light of this week's challenge, self-care is a really great way to maintain your in the zone emotional state. Time out, sleeping well, eating well, all of these give you the best chances of being emotionally balanced. What happens if we get out of the zone and we either go into the oversensitive or undersensitive zones. How do we get ourselves back into the zone so that we're more balanced? So it's more of the same really, but some quick fire ones are to stop and identify what your emotion is. Do some deep breathing. You know, it's like water and breathing are the two very basic things that we need, but we often struggle to get them right in our lives. So, you know, when we're stressed, we take short, sharp breaths into our upper chest. And that is either as a result of the stress response or inducing the stress response. But what we want to do is switch off that stress response and turn ourselves back to rest and repair, or rest and recovery, rest and digest, lots of sayings for the same thing. And taking long, deep, slow breaths into your belly rather than into your chest can help switch off that stress response and bring us back to a more balanced state. You could do some meditation, you could listen to some music. Music's a great way to shift our energy and our emotions. How many times have you listened to a song and it's taken you right back to, you know, your teenage years when you were out clubbing with your mates, or a really fond memory? So music can be really uplifting when you're feeling a bit out of sorts emotionally. It's definitely my go-to. Music is good. But I can also catch myself, if I've gone into that kind of numb stage, I can realize that I've not played my music. And that recognition allows me to put that music on and to shift my state. Essential oils are also a really great anchor in the same way that music is. So I have a book which is all about the essential oils and the emotions. So I often diffuse essential oils to support me emotionally. And if I have a client come to my house, I'll diffuse them in order to help them to open up and to feel calmer. The lavender oil, for example, is a very good anti-anxiety calming essential oil. Distraction, just go and do something else. If you find yourself ruminating or stuck on a particular thought or situation, distract yourself, go and do something else. You can't stop these thoughts coming in, but you do get to decide how long you spend on them. You know, you decide how much time you give to them. So go and do something else, ideally something positive that's going to make you feel good. Again, you need to get this in balance, because balance is my thing. Like, I just need to learn to keep everything in balance, and I've become more and more aware of when I'm going off kilter and bringing myself back to balance. So the severity from which I remove myself from balance gets less and less and less. You know, I've got this little bandwidth. So if this is balance, I used to be all the way over there or all the way over there, and now it's a bit more like this, and I'm able to keep it there in balance. But distraction for me went tipped over, you know, to a point where it became unhealthy. I would just do things all the time, which is why I was a massive overdoer, and would tie myself in lots of to-do lists because I was constantly distracting myself. So it's not something you want to be doing all of the time, but it is a tool to be used in that moment. Exercise, again, something like yoga especially, or Pilates, because it focuses on the breath, and that breath turns off the stress system and turns us back to rest and repair. Go and talk to somebody. You know, if you're feeling out of sorts, you feel like you're out of the optimal zone, go and talk to somebody and offload and receive some support and allow people to support you. And finally, and I'm only going to touch on this today because I want to do a whole session on this, but reframing, which is really about changing your perspective on a situation. And that comes down to our thoughts. So that was a whistle-stop tour of managing our emotions. Hopefully that's been useful. Tell me in the comments below what has been the most useful thing you've picked up in that. Whether it's recognizing that you're already doing the right stuff, or something you think, oh yeah, I'll give that a try. I'll see if that can help me. Tell me what has been most useful. Listen, give me some inspiration. What topics would you like me to cover? What would be useful for you? What are you dealing with? Whether that's mind or body, you know, I'll cover the whole shebang.